welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On this podcast, I have two interviews from the BC Council of Forest Industry's 2024 annual conference, which was just held in Vancouver. The first interview is with Don Iveson, the former mayor of Edmonton and current executive advisor on climate investing and community resilience for Cooperators Insurance. Iveson is also the co-chair for the Task Force for Housing and Climate, and he spoke to the important ways both the current affordable housing crisis and the present and future climate change emergency are linked together and can be mitigated in an integrated fashion. Here's that interview. I'd just like to start with, you just did a talk about climate change and resiliency, and it tied into the Task Force for Housing and Climate. Am I getting the title right? Yes. And which you're a sort of senior member of, and so maybe you can explain what the role of that is in terms of mitigating problems. And you also listed up the factors we have to address.
Yeah, we're short supplied on housing in this country, so we need to ramp up production to deal with the scarcity, which is driving up prices. But we need to, and there have been a lot of different task forces that have looked at that question and arrived at some of the same conclusions around the importance of factory-built approaches, regulatory reforms, all of which we covered in our report. But we were tasked with an additional lens, which is how do we deliver that housing in a climate-smart way? So first and foremost, how can we make sure that that housing is going to be resilient to the weather those homes are going to experience in the coming decades over the life of the structure, and not represent more risk, drive up insurance premiums, or really be at risk of loss if they were situated in the wrong place or built inadequately to the perils that we're seeing coming at us already. And then the other factor was, how can we make sure that we don't lock in a whole bunch more emissions that undermine our national emissions reductions plan targets? Because that's a lot of houses requiring a lot of energy if they're not efficient. And so building them to a higher standard to reduce the carbon, both in the construction side, and wood plays a huge role in that on the construction side, but also making sure that they're tight buildings that can also protect people from heat and extreme cold, especially if the power's off. So back to resilience, really putting a climate smart lens on the needed housing growth in the country, and no one had ever looked at both of those things in a Canadian context. So it was a privilege to get to work with the Honourable Lisa Raitt and Mike Moffat and Mark Carney and many other bright Canadian lights who think about these things to produce 140 recommendations to senior orders of government, or all three orders of government, I should say, on what would be necessary to deliver those homes at scale, make them affordable, and do it in a climate smart way.
One thing you mentioned was that unlike before, we're standing in one. Vancouver is a high-risk area, like we're on a fault line, and there's a bunch of other reasons. That shouldn't happen in the future. There shouldn't be high-risk places to build, is one of the points of the task force.
Well, we say don't build in high-risk areas, but we also acknowledge that there are a lot of legacy decisions that have been made, and then the key is mitigating those risks. So you can build in a seismically active area, but you need to be seismically resilient. And a lot of buildings need retrofit for known perils, whether that's water, whether that's heat, whether that's wind, or whether that's seismic. And they need energy retrofits. It's going to be a lot cheaper to take that building apart once and fix all of it. In the long run, it might be a little more expensive that first time, but to not do so is, bordering on negligent, really, now knowing what we know about the perils that are out there. So where you have a decision about expanding into high-risk areas and committing public infrastructure dollars and putting private capital at risk, and ultimately individual homeowners and families' largest asset at risk, that's another question really that goes to negligence, because the data, the mapping is now good enough that really shouldn't be happening. And even if municipalities and developers were to still make those errors, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to access financing and insurance in those situations. So the money is starting to push towards lower risk too on the private capital side. And so those are big trends that we need to be mindful of and hopefully ahead of in our urban planning, in our siting decisions, in our infrastructure decisions, and then in our up down to the level of the building permit. And then, but again, if you can mitigate for that risk by building a better building, even if there's an incremental cost to that, then that's the responsible thing to do is bear that cost if you're going to take that risk.
Another thing you mentioned was that the demographics are completely different from the last time we built a pile of housing, which was World War II, when everybody came back. It was the boomers. They were at the height of their youth, and we had prosperity, and we have kind of the exact opposite situation happening now.
Yeah, we've got an aging workforce. Less people want to be in the trades. We don't have an abundant group of people who are ready to go to work, who also have a lot of income, and a fast growing economy responding to all of that stimulus. We're constrained in a lot of ways now by high labor costs, high material costs, high land costs, and high energy costs. And so we have to build in a way that responds to that. And if I was a consumer today, I would be frustrated that I couldn't live in the kind of home that my parents or my grandparents had. But the fundamentals just don't support that. Doesn't mean you can't have a great quality of life in a denser community where things are closer at hand and more walkable, and where you have different transportation options than your parents or grandparents who may have had no choice but to drive everywhere, which again was a more affordable choice at one time than it is today. So our cities, the shape of our cities is changing already because of those market fundamentals. And our regulatory frameworks, our infrastructure priorities, and our financing models are still catching up to what those market realities mean in the housing market today.
And that ties into the next thing, which is modular. You said modular is not the way to get out of this, but is a way to help get out of this.
Well, we can't see as a task force any way that we ramp up, and even increase materially, much less double or more production of housing in this country without adopting mechanization and automation to overcome the labor challenge, but also to increase quality control for resilience and for efficiency, and then to create economies of scale through standardization, routinization, supply chain management to help bring costs back down so that you can incorporate those new resilience and sustainability features like energy efficiency at no net cost, because you've found efficiencies elsewhere through automation and through taking weather out of the equation, for example, by building inside instead of outside. So this is how lots of other places like Sweden do this. We just need to create the conditions for investment in that manufacturing capacity to come in. And not only would that be very helpful to housing and aligned with our climate objectives, it would actually be massively helpful on our productivity challenges in this country. So it's kind of a no-brainer from our perspective. And so a lot of our recommendations stress what all orders of government could do to create favorable conditions to unlock more factory-built housing in this country. And that's the only way we can see that we both achieve scale, but also achieve some efficiencies which we can use to offset those incremental costs of building better in light of the climate challenges.
And finally, neither of us are qualified to speak for Indigenous people, but you did highlight Indigenous leadership for this movement towards climate adaptation. And maybe you highlight a few leaders. Could you highlight them here?
We met with a number of folks during the work of the task force and had Indigenous members of the task force who taught us a lot and encouraged us to connect with Squamish Nation in particular for the leadership at CENAC here in Vancouver, and other interesting large precedents like Jericho. There are extraordinary examples from Manitoba as well that we're quite taken with. And so we do think there's an extraordinary role for Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations in the housing space, sometimes on their own, sometimes partnered with other actors, whether it's municipalities or private sector or universities. We have to get radically collaborative in this area, including unlocking and enabling more Indigenous leadership, which we were just blown away by what we saw, particularly in British Columbia. So we didn't see it our place to make recommendations to sovereign Indigenous groups, but wanted to lift up what's happening and make recommendations to local, provincial, and federal groups about how they could support more of that.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Our second interview is with Abacus Data CEO David Coletto. In his address to COFI 2024 delegates, he revealed public perception of the forestry industry has changed in a positive manner because of the continuing wildfire crisis. Most of those polled in BC understood the industry's role in mitigating wildfires when they occur, and changing practices to manage forestry resources in a way that addresses ongoing risks, a big change from the public's views of the industry in previous decades. Here's my talk with David.
I'm here with,
David Coletto, the Chair and CEO of Abacus Data.
and we're going to talk about the presentation you just gave. The key thing that struck me is that forestry had not a great reputation in this province before, and now it has a really good reputation, and it seems like, unlike practically anything else in the world these days, it's nonpartisan. So maybe you could go into what your findings were in that regard.
Yeah, I don't know if forestry had a bad reputation, but I think it struggled to demonstrate its relevance to people who didn't live in communities that work in the industry or those communities operate in. And I think what we learned from this research is, and I don't know if it's surprising, that the wildfires have created, the crisis around that has created a moment where, regardless of your political stripe, where you live in British Columbia, you know that this is a problem, you think it's going to get worse, and you've come to realize that forestry is actually part of the solution. And so they've gone from, for some, being perhaps the villain to now being perhaps part of the heroes that can help stop or at least make these fires worse than they might otherwise be.
That's something you pointed out, though, that while they might be the quote-unquote heroes, they can't make themselves out to be that. They have to look like they're, I guess, good stewards, for lack of a better term.
I think it's an opportunity for the industry to bring new audiences into the conversation they've been trying to have for years, which is they are, sustainable. They do care for the resource. They're not out there just clear cutting and taking everything that they can, and that actually some of that work, the active forest management, can be part of the solution. And the research we did, the public opinion survey we did, connects those dots, that people perceive there to be a problem. They understand that solution exists and they accept it, and they want government and industry to work together to do more of it across the province.
And another thing you found is that isn't just people in, let's say, well, to pick an example, Lytton, where they were obviously very affected by it. People in Vancouver who, are still affected by smoke coming in, but not at the same level. They still have the same level of consciousness about it. Yeah,
and I think that's what's a crisis does, is it raises what social researchers like me call the salience of issues. It becomes more top of mind. It becomes more clear that even if I'm not directly in the path of some of these fires, that the smoke means I can't go and enjoy the outside, or I worry about the health of family who might live close to these communities, or just the overall idea that this resource could just go up in smoke. I think is something that unites everybody. And so that, I think, is how this whole, I think it's been a paradigm shift in public perception around both the industry and the broader challenge of wildfires.
Now, we primarily cover construction. What's construction's role in all this? Because it is kind of tied to forestry, if for no other reason than that's a resource they use.
Yeah, I think there's going to be an increased recognition. Again, the more that forestry and forests are part of the lexicon, the more that you're going to find likely buy-in for things like mass timber, to see these products that come out of the sector being used in the construction sector. There's also, I think, a lot of similarities in terms of the role that construction has in helping to mitigate the broader impacts of climate change, but also specifically forest fires. So I think those in the construction sector can also be seen as part of the solution to helping stop this problem from getting worse.
Another thing you noted was that people are sort of aware of the term forest management. They don't maybe understand what it means, but also they don't need to know what it means in a way.
Yeah, somebody who asks lots of people lots of different questions, and we sometimes get caught up in believing that they need to understand everything to the minutia of it. They need to be experts. Well, we can't expect people to become experts on things, one, they're not that interested in, two, that they may not have the capacity to understand, because it's not what they know how to make sense of, but it's not needed. But you do need public support and a recognition that whatever technical process exists, that it is actually the solution. I don't need to know how active forest management works. I just need to trust and have confidence in all of the stakeholders involved who are actively using it or promoting it.
And you also point out to the forestry industry itself, most of which are in this room, that 10% of people don't agree, but those are the 10% of people you're going to hear from, and politicians know this from way back.
Yeah, and that's something we also have to keep reminding ourselves, that like you you feel like you're often under threat because the loudest voices, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. But I think the value of public opinion research, the work that I do, is to demonstrate to those decision makers, to others, that 10% is still the minority. They can have an outsized influence on shifting public opinion, which is why you've got to counter with your own story and be part of that conversation.
You also said the industry itself has to, like anybody else nowadays, not everybody's watching the news, unfortunately for me. You have to get them through other channels, and maybe they aren't doing that yet.
Yeah, it's always a recognition that, like, when technology changes, so too is how people get information. And as someone who studies sort of public affairs, communications, strategic communications, it's very clear that the generational gap between how people get news and information has never been wider. And so you just need to be aware that you may celebrate getting some mention in your news organization or on TV or others, but that only gets you to some of the audience. The rest of the audience might be active on social media, might rely on word of mouth, and so you almost have to be relentlessly telling your story to as many different channels as you can, because that's just how fragmented the market is today.
Now, you mentioned in your at the talk after the speech that you think the election might be closer. Is the forestry issue part of that, or you?
I think the election might be closer than we think, is because people are deeply anxious about a lot of different issues, and
including this issue.
Yeah, and that typically doesn't help incumbent governments. So not to say that the EV government deserves to be defeated, or people believe that, but if the political system kind of consolidates around one alternative, whether it's the BC Conservatives or the BC United, I think there's a chance it becomes competitive. And I do think, this election's coming it's coming after the summer.
Right.
And so if the summer is as bad as people predict it will be in terms of wildfires, how could this not be part of the conversation that people want to have? So I think it would be smart political strategy for everybody involved in politics today to be offering up solutions to people on how they would tackle this issue,
and at the same time not taking advantage of a terrible situation.
Absolutely not, and to not take advantage of it, but to be seen as collaborative and trying to find solutions, whether you're a government, a political party, or in this case the industry here.
And speaking of the industry, we've talked about the short term. What about longer term? Because this is not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon, even with good management.
Yeah, I think this is a problem we're going to be facing. I think climate change mitigation is something, and adaptation we're all going to have to deal with. And those that live and have forests are going to have to deal with this crisis. So, yeah, this is the sooner we figure out how to do it and get the public and everybody to agree and work together, the sooner I think we start to see solutions. I'm not an expert on any of this other than knowing that the public is there, and the work doesn't need to be done to bring them to a place where they understand there's a problem.
They already do.
This research shows they clearly do.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks so much.
And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music, as well as on Libsyn and at the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News websites. Thanks again for listening.